pleasure to be with you again today. Today we are continuing to study the book of Nehemiah. We are in chapter 2. In chapter 1, we saw the problem that Nehemiah would face in this book. Jerusalem's walls were in a state of disrepair. We saw his amazing prayer of confession as he comes before the Lord on behalf of his people. And we saw, though, that Nehemiah's work wasn't going to stop at prayer. He cared so much for his people. He wanted to pray for them, but then he wanted to be part of the solution. And God led him to be part of the solution for his people. So in chapter 2, we're going to see how Nehemiah started to do that. And we're going to learn how important it is prayer and how important planning and how these things work together. And when they work together well, relying on God's wisdom and making plans, then we can accomplish great things for him. I'd invite you to join me. We will be studying Nehemiah chapter 2, and as it's a fairly long chapter, I will read this in chunks, and then we'll discuss each chunk. So first, verses 1 through 8. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid, and I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Okay, so in the last chapter, we saw that it ended with Nehemiah praying, and that he was asking God's favor as he would approach this man. And this man meaning the king. So Nehemiah started to have the formulation of a plan that he was going to talk to the king to get permission to help his people. Now here it says it's the month of Nisan. In chapter 1, we see that it is the month Chislev. So this is about 4 months in between these two situations. So chapter 1 to chapter 2 is about a 4-month gap. Now it seems that during this 4 months, Nehemiah had been continuously praying, coming before the Lord in prayer on behalf of his people. But not only praying, also planning. And so we'll see moving forward as he's able to bring his plan to the king. So he wasn't wasting time. He was preparing for that perfect opportunity when he would have a chance to talk to the king. Now he says that he had not been sad in the king's presence. It seems this was against court traditions for officials or nobles to be sad in the presence of the king. The official's job was to serve the king and make him happy. So the king's feelings were the most important. The king seemingly did not want to be reminded of the troubles of his people. They were to do their jobs well and leave their problems outside the court. After all, their problems would be considered far less important than the very smallest of the king's own problems. Actually, this shows the perspective at the time that the king's happiness and well-being was a primary concern. The people existed to serve the king, not the other way around. Actually, God wants his leaders to exist to serve those around them rather than just demanding others to serve them. Now the king, though, noticed Nehemiah's sadness. He says, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick?" It seems that Nehemiah had kept it to himself for quite some time. But on this day, whether intentionally or unintentionally, his sadness was visible enough that the king noticed it. Now notice Nehemiah's response. He was afraid. He wasn't excited about the opportunity to share with the king, or at least that wasn't his primary emotion. He was scared of what the king would do to him for breaking this tradition. Potentially, even his neck was on the line. Artaxerxes certainly could have fired him, but he could do a lot worse. Kings had total power to do whatever they wanted to their people. Just as in the story of Joseph, the king just said, okay, baker and cupbearer, you're going to be killed. And one of them he eventually pardoned, but he killed the other. Kings at that time didn't require much of a reason to have people killed. But even though he was afraid, notice how he responded. He was scared, but he didn't let the fear control him. He didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He didn't turn around and run out of the court. Nehemiah didn't apologize. He didn't beg for mercy or forgiveness. He was afraid, but he knew there was an opportunity here. And he realized this is the opportunity he had been waiting for. So he's very respectful. Let the king live forever. In other words, king, I know you're very important, but I still want to bring this problem to you as you've asked me. He says, why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So we see that Nehemiah was a person like us, okay? Sometimes we get the idea that these biblical characters are superheroes and they never get afraid. They never have any feelings like that. But we see, no, he did get afraid like we do. But he shows us that God doesn't want us to allow our fear to control us. We must move past our fear. A psalmist said, when I'm afraid, I'll put my trust in you. When I'm afraid, I'll put my trust in you. In other words, we get afraid, but when that happens, we turn to the Lord rather than soaking ourselves in that fear. So we must move past our fear. Now, there's a lot of things we might be afraid or nervous about, perhaps sharing the gospel, changing jobs, public preaching, leading a Bible study, discipling others, telling your parents about the Lord. Maybe you need to confront someone who's in sin. Maybe speaking up against peer pressure or some evils in society, or getting married even. These situations require us to be bold and to look to the Lord for help. Back to the passage, let the king live forever. He's very polite. He lets the king know that even though he's sad, it doesn't mean that he is a bad employee, that he's a bad subject. He's not committing rebellion. He does have a legitimate concern. And then the king asked him for his request. He says, what are you requesting? In the last chapter, we saw that Nehemiah was praying about this issue. He was also praying that God would grant him favor in the eyes of the king. That was a specific prayer request he brought to the Lord. Now we see his prayers are being answered. But notice Nehemiah sees that it's being answered and he responds appropriately to it. This is simple, but it's an important lesson. When you pray for something, watch carefully for the answer. We don't want to just pray for something and then miss it when the answer is right in front of us. We should pray and then we should be ready for when that answer comes, and he was. Now, I find this next phrase so amazing, so encouraging. The king says, what are you requesting? And again, like in chapter 1, Nehemiah doesn't just rush into it and give his answer. Even though we will see he had an answer ready to go, he doesn't just jump in and say, this is the problem, this is what I need, and so on. It says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. Can you imagine right there in the court, the most powerful man in the world at that time, on the throne, you're breaking court tradition by being sad and at risk of incurring the king's wrath if your answer isn't right. But instead of just charging ahead, he takes a moment and he prays. Now, what does that look like? I seriously doubt he closed his eyes and knelt down on the floor to pray. This was a spontaneous prayer, most likely a nonverbal prayer in his heart. Even in the heat of the moment, he didn't rely on his own wisdom. He tosses up one more heartfelt prayer to God. It was probably a very quick, very silent prayer, and most likely, God help me, or give me wisdom. But that prayer had power, and it had power because it matched Nehemiah's life of prayer. So in chapter 1, we see the long prayer, the days and days of coming before the Lord, in fasting, in mourning, in that committed time of prayer before the Lord. And then here we see the spontaneous prayer. Both kinds are important. We need a lifestyle of prayer, praying in private, bringing serious issues before the Lord, and then throughout the day when we encounter different situations, either a temptation, we pray for strength, or a decision that we need to make, we pray for wisdom, or we need favor from an official and we pray for God to open that door. Both types of prayer combine together. This prayer has power because it matches Nehemiah's life of prayer. If we just do the spontaneous prayers, but we don't match that with private prayer before the Lord, those same prayers may lack the power. Now, we learn from Nehemiah here also that we should rely on God all the time. No situation is too urgent to offer up a quick prayer of help. Our lives should be saturated in prayer, and our natural response when we face decisions, trials, temptations, emergencies should be to say, God, help me. And that could be very fast. But let's say, God help me. Even as you're saving the child from a fire in a house that is being burnt and collapsed, you can say, God help me, as you run through that door and try to save that child out. So he prays, and then he brings his request to the king. He's very frank, says, if it pleases the king, and if your servants found favor in your sight, you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Boom. One verse, one sentence. He doesn't beat around the bush, doesn't tell this long story. He says, look, send me there. I want to rebuild it. That's it. But that's a huge request, right? Generally, kings would tend to be skeptical of walled cities and other nationalities that were subjected to them. If Jerusalem was walled, then logic says the people in it may decide to rebel again. But yet Nehemiah wasn't afraid to make big requests. Why not? Well, we know he already prayed about it. And I believe that God had already led him to make this plan and to have this request ready to go. He knew what he was going to ask before the king even asked him. Now, William Carey, a missionary to India, said, attempt great things for God and ask great things of God. This should be our attitude as well. So don't ask the question, what can I do? That question is actually too small. Ask the question, what needs to be done? That's the question Nehemiah asked. If he said, what can I do? He would say, I'm just one person. What can I do to rebuild a wall? Looks like you can't. But he said, what needs to be done? What needs to be done is the wall needs to be rebuilt. And after he realized what needed to be done, he was bold enough to go for it. This request was quite abnormal. There seems to be no benefit for the king to lose a trusted official and a good employee to go and build a wall around a city of people who are subjected to you who may rebel after there's a wall. It doesn't seem likely that most kings would want to give a favorable answer. But God was obviously working, and we'll see at the last part of this chapter that, or the last part of this section, that Nehemiah acknowledges that God gave him favor. Now the king, before he said yes or no, then he says, how long will you be gone and when will you return? So give me more information. Okay, you have this request, you want to go, but what's actually your plan? And then verse 7, I said to the king, and then he starts laying out his plan. So notice the king says, how long will this take? Tell me the details of your plan. And Nehemiah doesn't just scratch his head and say, I don't know, I'll go there, I'll get some people together, we'll find some tools and we'll work on it, and don't worry, everything will be good. No, he has this very specific plan. He researched the situation. He knew about how long it would take to go, how long it would take to build the wall, and how long it would take to get back. So trusting in God is not an excuse for lack of preparation. Instead, it's a reason to prepare all the more because we believe God will give us a chance to put those plans into action. And there's many verses on this. We'll look at Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. So Nehemiah wasn't hasty. He was diligent and he had a good plan. Also, Proverbs 16:3. Commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. So you have plans, that's good, but you need to trust in the Lord. He will establish those plans. That's what Nehemiah did. Also James 4:13 through 15. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. So we should always say, if it's the Lord's will, I will do this. So yes, it's good to make a plan, but don't leave God out of the equation and make a plan on your own. Okay, so moving back to the passage at hand, we see that Nehemiah was ready to go with a plan and a clear answer. Now, notice he also makes many additional requests. He says, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river. So these letters would give them permission to pass through. But not just that, he asked for a letter to Asaph, who is a keeper of the king's forest. Why? So that supply keeper of the forest could give him wood to make beams for the gate. So not only do we want to make a wall, but we want you to fund it. We want to use your supplies to make that wall. Amazing. Now, when we think about that, we think also, how did Nehemiah know the name of this person, Asaph? Some, keeper of a king's forest somewhere. It would seem unlikely that they were going to haul the materials for the wall the entire 5-month journey from Susa. Did they actually take the wood for the wall on this 5-month journey from Susa to Jerusalem? I don't think so. So likely this forest was closer to Jerusalem, somewhere on the way. Now it would seem unlikely, again, that Nehemiah and the other officials would automatically know the names of all the people in the huge Persian government. That means Nehemiah had already researched this issue ahead of time. He'd gotten all the information he needed. He had his entire plan ready to go, and he knew what he needed to communicate to the king when the opportunity came up, so that he would know exactly what to say. Again, imagine if the king says, what do you want to do? And he says, oh, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. Let me get back to you. Chance gone. Opportunity wasted. But he had a detailed plan ready to go. And actually, by bringing out his plan, A, B, C, D, so precise and clear, he demonstrates to the king he's competent. He can be entrusted with this task. He gave confident answers, which made the king confident that he knew what he was doing, and built up credibility and trust. This request for materials was the largest yet. Again, we want to rebuild the wall and we want to use your materials to do it. And the king said, sure, go for it. Wow. The only conclusion that one could make is what Nehemiah himself very clearly realized. The king granted me what I asked. Why? For the good hand of my God was upon him. He made a huge ask of the king, and the king gave it to him, and Nehemiah says, I know why he did it. He did it because God moved his heart, and he trusted that God was going to do that because he knew that God would keep his promise, keep his covenant, and care for his people. What an amazing example. Like Nehemiah, we must also prepare ahead for the task God has in store for us. Be diligent. We can and should make plans. When we do, we must pray to God for wisdom and not leave God out of the plans. Also, sometimes we make plans of our own and then we say, God bless the plan that I made, rather than bringing God into the process from the very beginning. And a lazy person says, I will trust in God. I don't need to make plans. I don't need to prepare. A prideful person says, I will make and execute plans on my own. I don't need God. We don't want to be prideful, and we don't want to be lazy. And then, as Nehemiah did, we should give the glory for God. He didn't take the credit for himself and said, I got it because I was ready and I'd done my research. No, he realized it was God's good favor. The good hand of my God was upon me. So at every stage of this process, Nehemiah gives us a very good example. The problem comes, he's empathetic, he prays and prays and prays for 4 months. Then he has the opportunity. to come before the king. He offers another spontaneous prayer, and then he combines that with the plan that he's made, and then he gives all the credit to God. So let's move forward. Nehemiah is going to come to Jerusalem. Verse 9 through 16. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me, but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. All right, so Nehemiah sets off for Jerusalem, and this skips another 4 months or so about the journey. The king had sent officers of the army with him to keep him safe on the way, another example of God's favor with him. Now in verse 10, we see some characters who will turn out to be the villains of the story. Spoiler alert. These guys are going to be very, very pesky adversaries. They were both likely officials. Note that in verse 9, Nehemiah was showing governors the letters from the king. He hadn't told others about his purpose yet. But both Sanballat and Tobiah heard about his plan in verse 9, meaning they were either governors themselves or they were officials probably with some high ranking, that they would have heard about this very, very quickly. So Nehemiah arrives there, and basically the first 3 days are spent planning and surveying. He wants to know exactly what the project in front of him would require. Again, he doesn't make rash decisions. He doesn't just charge in and start talking and telling all the things. He's not a big talker so much as he first prepares, and he only talks when he's ready to do so. A leader should understand all the difficulties in front of him. And so that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to propose his plan only to be surprised when someone points out a huge problem that he knew nothing about. So again, there's an application for us here. Don't be hasty. Don't make rash decisions. Don't act without thinking and researching. Before making important decisions, we should spend the necessary time required to gather all the information which we will need. We see that Nehemiah went out by night. He didn't want to tell others his plan yet, so he did a surveying by night. Again, he wanted to get all his ducks in a row. He wanted to understand the whole situation, all the potential problems, and make a plan before he could present it to the people. So he didn't just arrive and start talking. He made a plan first, and so he went out by night so that people wouldn't see what he was doing or ask a lot of questions that he wasn't ready to answer. Now moving forward, verses 17 through 20, he starts sharing about his plan. He says, Then I said to them, that appears to be the Jews, the priests, the nobles, and the officials, and all the rest who are due to work. Then I said to them, You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Then I replied to them, The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Okay, so Nehemiah comes right to it. He gives a proposal to rebuild Jerusalem. He says, Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. Now, it's likely that these verses are a summary of what was said rather than a complete record. We know that Nehemiah is a very detail-oriented person. In verse 18, he tells them about the king's words, but he doesn't record that conversation there. So this was probably a much longer conversation, which is condensed for us here. But the main point is, let's build the wall that we don't suffer shame anymore. So firstly, the what? We're going to rebuild the wall together. Secondly, the why. Well, Jerusalem is in bad shape. Thirdly, the who. God was with them. And this was all the reason they needed to do it. He said, let us arise and build. Some translations, not ESV, says, let us arise and build. And I love that word, arise, that idea. Let's go. Let's get to it. Let's do it. It's time to stop sitting down. It's time to stop resting. It's time to stop enjoying ourselves or just focusing on our own work and our own thing and our own careers. It's time to stop being complacent. It's time to take action. They needed unity. And every work for God is like that. Nehemiah is a very visionary leader. He sees a problem and he wants to help solve it, but he doesn't just do it on his own. In fact, he couldn't do it on his own. It's too big. So he needed to bring other people into this task, and he gives them a speech and he encourages them. He leads them by example, and he gets them to look to the right place. He doesn't say, let's do this because I've got a plan. Let's do this because I'm ready and I'm the guy and I'm the man for the job. He says, let's do this because of him, the hand of God that had been upon me for good. Look, this is of God. God has made this possible. The king has given permission. The king has given us the supplies. This is all because of what God has done in his heart. God's sovereign. We have a job to do. Let's get to it. All right, here's the one I was looking for a minute ago. Let us rise up and build. So that was their conclusion. They agreed. Let's do it. Let's do it. Now, you perhaps do not have a wall to build. Maybe you do. For those in Montana, you're building a fence around your ranch. But for most of us, we don't have walls to build. A lot of us live in cities already, and cities don't have walls. So you might say, well, what does this have to do with us? Well, we all have something to build for God. What does he want you to build? And are you building it? Maybe you need to build your family. The one says, he who labors in vain unless it's from the Lord. And that the one who builds his house labors in vain unless it's from the Lord or the Lord is in it. I forgot the exact words. We need to build our families. We need to build our church. We need to build our community. Are we building something for God? Perhaps leading a fellowship, perhaps leading Sunday school, perhaps leading a Bible study. We are to be building God's kingdom, and we do it through different gifts that God's given to us. Maybe through art, maybe through music, maybe through hospitality, through serving, through evangelism, through generosity. There's many, many ways. But we are to build something for God, something that will last. When we face him on Judgment Day and he tests all of our works with fire, we don't want it to be all burned up like wood, hay, and stubble. We want something remaining which we have built, which we can present to him and say, this is the work that I've done for you, and it is a work that will last. We can spend our life building our kingdom, or we can spend our life building his kingdom. Building for God takes an effort. It's not easy. It's a lot easier to sit and do nothing. People sit about 1/3 of their lives. It's not always bad to sit. I'm sitting now. Maybe you are. The lesson for you today, though, might be very simple. God may want you to arise and build for him. So let's put our hands together for the good work. This is what they said. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. They said, let's go, let's do it. But notice verse 19, but they have some enemies, but they have some opposition. And it just mentions them a little bit here. They start off with words, with mocking them. What are you trying to do? Are you rebelling against the king? They try to discourage them. They realize the best time to attack is right at the beginning, before they start. This isn't possible. It's too difficult. What are you trying to do? Mocking them, laughing at them, trying to dishearten the workers before they begin. Perhaps you've decided you want to build something for God, you want to do work for God, and then before you even start, the temptations already start to come. Do it later, it's too difficult, who do you think you are, you can't do that for God, and all kinds of ideas and things might come into your mind, either from inside or from outside, which will tempt you not to do it. We'll see a lot more from these adversaries later on in this passage, but this verse is a glimpse of what is going to come, and that is they're going to face a lot of adversity, a lot of obstacles. It's not as simple as saying, let's go build, and then boom, it's going to be done. There's going to be challenges on the way. And so this is Nehemiah's way of showing us we should be ready to face those challenges when they come, because they surely will. Nehemiah responds very strongly and quickly against them. To paraphrase, go away, you have no right here. We don't care what you say. We're not interested. And so he doesn't try to negotiate or spend a long time chatting with them. He realizes who these people are. They're enemies of the work of God. And he doesn't try to engage them. He just says, we're not going to listen to you. So moving forward, we will see a lot more from these villains, these adversaries, as they try to build the walls of Jerusalem. For this lesson in chapter 2, we are reminded the importance of prayer, both the time in our room, in private praying, and those spontaneous prayers. And we were reminded of the importance of combining prayer with planning. And then saying we want to build, we want to do something for God, have a plan for doing something for God. Of course, pray about that first, enduring, and then by His grace, carry it out. Let us serve Him and make a difference for Him wherever He has put us. I hope that this lesson in Nehemiah 2 has been encouraging for you. I'd invite you to join us next time as we study and obey Nehemiah 3. God bless.